It all started with the simplest of intentions. A summer drought had left the lawns in my neighborhood parched, gardens withered, and water bills skyrocketing. Like anyone with a sense of foresight, I decided to take a practical step, installing a few rain barrels along the side of my house. It wasn't anything elaborate at first, just sturdy blue barrels that caught runoff from my gutters. Each rainfall turned into a little reserve of life, and soon I had enough to water my plants, wash my car, and keep the lawn green while my neighbors' yards turned brown and brittle. But in the world of HOAs, practicality doesn't always mean peace. The moment the barrels became visible from the street, whispers began. I noticed them first from across the cul-de-sac, neighbors pointing, shaking their heads, murmuring disapprovingly. Some looked curious, others jealous. But one person in particular, our HOA president, looked absolutely outraged. The HOA in our community prided itself on what they called aesthetic uniformity. Every house had to look the same shade of beige, every lawn trimmed to exactly the same height, and every decorative item approved in advance. The rain barrels, practical as they were, did not fit into their pristine vision of control. And within a week, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The letter was written in bold, officious language. It claimed that my rain barrels violated community guidelines, posed visual clutter, and were subject to immediate removal. If I refused, the fine would be $100 per day until I complied. I remember standing at my kitchen counter, letter in hand, heart pounding with both frustration and disbelief. Collecting rainwater, something as natural as breathing, was being treated like a crime. At first, I considered simply hiding the barrels, moving them behind the fence, disguising them with shrubs, or painting them to blend in with the house. But the more I thought about it, the more it angered me. Why should I hide something that was not only harmless but beneficial? Why should I bow down to an HOA that thrived on control rather than common sense? That night, as rain pattered against the roof and filled the barrels, I stood at the window and thought deeper. The barrels weren't just water, they were potential. Potential energy, potential independence, potential freedom from the grasp of those who thought they held power over every aspect of our lives. The next morning, instead of removing them, I bought more. Neighbors watched with a mix of shock and fascination as a delivery truck unloaded additional barrels, this time larger and sturdier. I lined them up along the side of my house, connecting them with hoses and filters. The HOA president herself drove by slowly, glaring through her tinted SUV window as though I had set fire to the manicured lawns. I knew the fines would start piling up soon. I knew letters, threats, maybe even legal action would follow. But I also knew something the HOA didn't. I had no intention of simply storing water. My plan was much bigger. You see, I had been tinkering in my garage for months. Solar panels, small wind turbines, and a makeshift system for converting water pressure into usable power. It was a side project, something I never fully pursued until now. The HOA's attempt to punish me had lit a fire I couldn't put out. If they wanted to fine me for collecting rainwater, I would take that rainwater and turn it into something unstoppable. Not just a quiet rebellion, but a transformation so undeniable that even my most critical neighbors would have no choice but to see its value. And so, in the shadow of looming fines, I began building. Pipes, pumps, generators, all fueled by the simple, pure resource falling from the sky. Each barrel became not just storage but part of a network, a system that could produce real, tangible electricity. I didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a war. A war between a single homeowner and an HOA board determined to crush anything they couldn't control. A war that would escalate beyond letters and fines into something that would shake the entire neighborhood and eventually power it. Because what started with a few raindrops was about to grow into a storm. The first fine arrived quicker than expected. A crisp envelope, hand-delivered by a board member, slid under my front door before sunrise. Inside was a typed notice stamped with the HOA's insignia. The words were sharp, like daggers on the page. Violation continues. Fine of $100 issued. Daily penalties will accrue until compliance one day. $100 by the end of the week, $700. It was a calculated move. They thought the fines would scare me into quick submission, that the mounting pressure of debt would force me to cave in. But what they didn't understand was that money wasn't my greatest motivator. Freedom was. And every letter, every fine, every attempt to intimidate me only fueled my determination to finish what I had started. Still, I wasn't blind to the weight of their tactics. They had power. They had influence. They could place liens on properties, escalate legal battles, and drag homeowners through courts if they chose. For most people, that kind of threat would have been enough to send the barrels rolling to the landfill. But not for me. Not anymore. I spent those days working in the garage, the hum of tools drowning out the HOA's attempts at control. With each turn of the wrench, each wire connected, I built not just a system, but a shield. The barrels were now linked to a central pump, which fed into a turbine I had rigged from salvaged equipment. It wasn't polished, it looked more like a science fair project than a commercial setup, but it worked. Slowly, I began generating usable current. The first night I flipped the switch and saw a bulb glow in my garage, powered purely by collected rainwater. I knew there was no going back. That light wasn't just illumination, it was defiance. Proof that I could harness something they couldn't fine, restrict, or control. Of course, the HOA didn't stop at letters. They began patrolling the neighborhood more aggressively. Board members walked the sidewalks with clipboards, snapping photos of my house. They noted the barrels, the pipes, even the wiring peeking out from the garage window. I could feel their eyes on me every time I stepped outside. Neighbors whispered louder now, some in support, others in disapproval. The tension was no longer hidden, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. But something unexpected began happening. As I powered more lights and appliances in my home, I noticed a ripple of curiosity among my neighbors. The Smiths next door, tired of their $300 electricity bills, started asking subtle questions. The Johnsons across the street, struggling to keep their lawn green, eyed my thriving grass with envy. Even those who mocked at first began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I was onto something. The HOA noticed too, and that made them desperate. A month into the standoff, they escalated. Not only were the fines piling into the thousands, but they issued a community-wide bulletin. It accused me of recklessly endangering neighborhood safety, claiming my setup was unapproved electrical work that posed fire risks. They painted me as a reckless rebel, a troublemaker jeopardizing the entire block. It was a strategic smear campaign designed to turn neighbor against neighbor. For some it worked. A handful of homeowners openly confronted me, parroting the HOA's warnings. But others began to see the truth, that the board was more interested in control than safety. After all, no fire had been sparked, no injury caused. The only thing endangered was their authority. The breaking point came when the HOA president herself, the same woman who had glared from her SUV weeks earlier, knocked on my door. She didn't come with a smile or neighborly courtesy. She came armed with legal documents, threats of lawsuits, and promises to make an example out of me if I didn't comply. But what she didn't realize was that by then, I wasn't working alone. Quietly, some of my neighbors had begun to help. The Smiths donated old solar panels they no longer used. The Johnsons lent me tools. Another neighbor, an electrician, offered guidance on wiring everything safely. What started as my personal rebellion was becoming a neighborhood project, growing in strength right under the HOA's nose. So when the president threatened me, I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply closed the door, went back to the garage, and continued building. Because by then the barrels weren't just rainwater collectors. They were the backbone of a small but functional microgrid. My lights, fridge, and even parts of my HVAC system now ran on power the sky itself had given me. Each rainfall made me stronger, each barrel fuller, each turbine faster, and the HOA knew they were losing control. The president's face, the day she saw my porch lit up brighter than ever during a power outage that left half the neighborhood in darkness, said it all. In that moment, I wasn't just a homeowner defying fines. I was the one house with light in the storm, the one house with power when the grid failed. And my neighbors noticed. That was the moment the war escalated. The HOA wouldn't just fine me now, they would try to break me completely. But what they didn't understand was that the storm had only just begun. The night my porch lights shone through the blackout marked a turning point. Until then, the HOA believed they could control the narrative. They thought they could portray me as reckless, irresponsible, a rogue homeowner who endangered the community. But when the storm knocked out power across half the neighborhood, the truth cut through the darkness. Families huddled in candlelight while my house glowed like a beacon. Children pressed their faces to fogged-up windows, pointing at the one home with steady light. Parents carried flashlights that dimmed against the glow of my living room lamps. Whispers spread through the rain-soaked streets. How was he still powered? How did he do it? The HOA president didn't like that. Not one bit. The very next morning, she launched her counterattack. She ordered an emergency board meeting, distributed flyers accusing me of unauthorized energy generation, and even suggested my system was feeding back into the grid illegally. None of it was true. Of course, I had designed the setup as a closed loop, entirely separate from the main grid. But facts never stopped an HOA board on the warpath. I wasn't just a violator anymore, I was a threat. Soon, inspectors began showing up. City code enforcement, fire safety officers, even utility representatives appeared on my doorstep. Each time I showed them the setup. Each time they left shaking their heads, unable to find a legitimate violation. I followed safety guidelines, used proper grounding, and consulted with the electrician neighbor to ensure everything was compliant. But the HOA kept pushing, hoping one of the agencies would bend to their pressure. When legal channels didn't work, they tried intimidation. Late one night I heard rattling outside. When I stepped into the yard, I found one of my barrels tipped over, water spilling across the lawn. At first I thought it might have been the wind until I noticed footprints in the mud. The sabotage wasn't subtle. Someone had crept onto my property to destroy what they couldn't regulate. It wasn't the last attempt. Over the next few weeks, hoses were cut, pipes loosened, wires tampered with. I installed cameras and caught shadows moving near the barrels, but the figures always kept their faces hidden. Neighbors whispered it was the HOA board members themselves, sneaking around at night like vandals in suits. I couldn't prove it, but I didn't need to. The sabotage only strengthened the perception that the board had lost control. Meanwhile, my system kept growing. What started as barrels and turbines expanded into a true hybrid grid. With donated solar panels mounted on my roof, the barrels now fed a battery bank that stored energy even on dry days. Lights, appliances, Wi-Fi, everything hummed steadily, independent of the utilities the HOA thought they controlled. And the more reliable my system became, the more my neighbors noticed. One by one, they began asking for help. At first, it was small things: a gallon of water to keep plants alive, a borrowed power cord during an outage. But soon they wanted in on the whole system. The Smiths asked if they could set up a barrel of their own. The Johnsons wanted to chip in for another battery bank. Even skeptical families began offering support, tired of rising utility bills and impressed by the independence I had carved out under fire. What was once my private rebellion was slowly transforming into a neighborhood movement. The HOA fought harder, but their control was slipping. They issued more fines, adding up to thousands on paper, but fewer neighbors cared. They called emergency meetings, but fewer homeowners attended. They threatened lawsuits, but their words fell flat against the undeniable glow of porch lights fueled by nothing but rain and sun. That's when the HOA took their most desperate step yet. Late one evening, a letter arrived, not a fine this time, but a notice of lien. They were officially moving to claim my property if I didn't comply. It was their nuclear option, their last attempt to crush me financially and legally. For most people, this would have been the endgame. The threat of losing a home is enough to force surrender. But they miscalculated, because by now the fight wasn't just mine. My neighbors had seen too much, gained too much, and relied too much on the system we had built together. The night the lien letter arrived, word spread across the block. By morning, people were at my door, not with complaints, but with offers to stand with me. One neighbor suggested petitioning the city to review the HOA's authority. Another proposed pooling money to fight the legal battle. Others simply said, "We've got your back." The HOA wanted me isolated, desperate, and afraid. Instead, they had created something they couldn't control: unity. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. They had played their strongest card, and I had no intention of folding. If they wanted a war over water and power, then that's exactly what they were going to get. And in wars, storms always hit hardest before the sky clears. The lien notice was supposed to break me. For most homeowners, it would have been the final blow, an iron chain locking them into compliance. But instead of collapsing under the pressure, I watched something incredible unfold. The neighborhood had seen enough. They had seen the barrels, the sabotage, the endless fines. They had seen lights in my windows while the rest of the block sat in darkness. They had watched me stand alone against a board that seemed less like a group of volunteers and more like an occupying force. And now, Faced with the possibility that the HOA would take my home, my neighbors decided they weren't going to stand by quietly anymore. The first sign of resistance came as whispers. Homeowners murmured about unfair treatment, about abuse of power, about how ridiculous it was to punish someone for using rainwater. The whispers grew into conversations, and soon, conversations turned into action. Petitions began circulating. At first they were simple, a demand to remove the lien signed by a handful of neighbors. But the more people signed, the bolder the demands became. Calls to reduce HOA authority, calls to remove the president, calls to hold a vote of no confidence. For every letter the HOA sent, 10 signatures appeared against them. And all the while I kept building. The system was no longer just for me. It was becoming the backbone of a neighborhood network. We linked barrels together across yards, connected solar panels donated by residents, and built a battery reserve in my garage that now powered not just my house, but 2 others on the block. When the Smith's fridge stayed cold during another outage, word spread faster than any HOA flyer. Soon, rain power became more than a phrase. It became a rallying cry. But the HOA wasn't going to give up quietly. They hired lawyers, sending out letters filled with dense legal jargon designed to intimidate. They claimed we were operating an unlicensed utility, endangering community infrastructure and violating deed restrictions. Each letter was more aggressive than the last. But the more they sent, the more transparent their desperation became. Then came the surveillance. Board members parked their cars near my home for hours, watching, waiting, hoping to catch some violation they could use against me. Drones buzzed overhead, cameras pointing down toward the barrels. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel their eyes, their frustration, their fear. Because deep down, they knew control was slipping from their hands, and it wasn't just slipping, it was crumbling. At the next HOA meeting, something unprecedented happened. Instead of homeowners quietly nodding along while the board made decisions, people stood up. One after another, they questioned the president's authority, demanded transparency, and challenged the endless fines. The board tried to shout them down, but the voices kept rising. That night, the boardroom didn't feel like their kingdom anymore. It felt like the people's. Meanwhile, I doubled down. The barrels weren't just barrels anymore, they were symbols. I painted them, not to hide them, but to display them proudly. Bright blues, greens, and even murals created by neighborhood kids covered the once unsightly containers. What the HOA called visual clutter became a gallery of community pride. The tipping point came during a brutal heat wave. The power grid buckled under the strain, and once again outages swept through the area. But this time, more than just my home had light. The Smiths, the Johnsons, and several others powered fans, refrigerators, and even small AC units using our network of rainwater-fed energy. While the rest of the city sweltered in the dark, our block thrived. News travels fast in desperate times. Within hours, cars from nearby neighborhoods rolled through, curious about the rainwater street that still had power. Reporters showed up, cameras rolling, eager to capture the story of a community defying both an outage and its own HOA. That was the moment the board lost their grip for good. Because no matter how many fines they issued, no matter how many threats they made, they couldn't erase the image broadcast on local news. Families smiling under the glow of lights powered by nothing more than water and determination. The HOA's carefully constructed image of order and control shattered against the undeniable proof of resilience. But victory was not complete. The lien still loomed, the legal threats still lingered, and the board was not finished fighting. They had lost the neighborhood, but they still had their lawyers, their bylaws, and their stubborn refusal to admit defeat. For me, the fight was no longer just about rainwater or power. It was about principle, about proving that no one, not even a homeowners association, had the right to crush innovation, independence, or community spirit under the weight of fines and intimidation. And as I stood in my garage, surrounded by humming turbines, glowing batteries, and barrels brimming with water, I realized something else. This wasn't just a rebellion anymore, it was a revolution. The summer of resistance had reached its boiling point. By now, the HOA had exhausted their tricks. Endless fines, smear campaigns, sabotage, even a lien. But nothing had broken me. In fact, every attempt only made the neighborhood stronger. What started as one man's rebellion had become a united movement. Yet the HOA still had one weapon left, one final battlefield where they believed they could crush me. The courtroom. The summons came in a thick envelope, stuffed with documents heavy enough to intimidate. The HOA had filed a lawsuit claiming I had violated deed restrictions, created unsafe living conditions, and refused to pay thousands in accumulated fines. Their demand was clear: dismantle the system, pay the penalties, and submit to their authority, or lose the house entirely. For a moment, the weight of it sank into me like a stone. This wasn't just about barrels anymore. This was about my home, my livelihood, and the principle I had stood on for months. The thought of losing everything over something as harmless as collecting rainwater burned like fire in my chest. But then came the knock on the door. One by one, my neighbors filed in, arms full of documents, laptops open, determination etched across their faces. Some had legal backgrounds, others simply brought moral support, but together, they formed an army. What the HOA thought would isolate me only drew the neighborhood tighter. We prepared day and night. We gathered evidence, photographs of the system, inspection reports proving it was safe, testimonies from families who had benefited during outages. We collected every flyer, every threatening letter, every fine stacked up like bricks in a wall of harassment. The deeper we dug, the more we uncovered. The HOA had bent their own bylaws, ignored community votes, and even spent funds without approval. What was supposed to be my trial was quickly shaping into theirs. The courtroom day arrived, the air thick with tension. On one side sat the HOA's lawyers in sharp suits, smug expressions plastered across their faces. On the other, a ragtag but resolute group of neighbors standing not as defendants but as a community. The HOA's case was built on fear. They painted me as a dangerous rebel who had installed illegal utilities that threatened property values. They claimed the barrels were eyesores, the wiring a fire hazard, the entire setup an act of reckless defiance. They spoke in long, rehearsed sentences, hoping the weight of their words would overshadow the lack of truth behind them. But then it was our turn. We presented inspection records showing the system was safe and fully compliant with city codes. We displayed photos of smiling families lit by clean, renewable energy, while the rest of the neighborhood sat in blackout. We introduced testimony from the electrician neighbor, who vouched for every wire and connection. And then we handed over the thick stack of HOA letters, proof of harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. The room shifted. What began as a trial against me quickly transformed into an indictment of the HOA itself. Their polished facade cracked under the weight of evidence. The smug expressions faded as the judge flipped through letter after letter, each one dripping with hostility and control. And then came the final blow. The petition. Dozens of signatures from homeowners across the neighborhood, declaring not just support for me, but opposition to the HOA's actions. It was more than testimony. It was the voice of the people they claimed to represent, united against them. The judge listened carefully, asking pointed questions, drilling into both sides. Hours passed like minutes as the courtroom battle unfolded, and when it was finally over, the ruling came down like a hammer of justice. The lien was invalidated. The fines were thrown out, and the HOA's authority to restrict rainwater collection was struck down as overreach. The victory sent a shockwave through the room. My neighbors erupted in relief, some even in tears. The HOA board members sat in stunned silence, their power stripped bare for all to see. What was meant to be their triumph had become their downfall, but the judge didn't stop there. She issued a warning to the board, noting their pattern of harassment and abuse. She ordered an independent audit of their finances and recommended a community vote to review their leadership. It wasn't just a legal win, it was the unraveling of their control. When we walked out of that courthouse, the sun seemed brighter, the air lighter. Neighbors gathered around, clapping me on the back, thanking me not just for standing firm, but for giving them the courage to resist. The barrels, once symbols of defiance, had become emblems of freedom. Yet even in victory, I knew the battle wasn't truly over. The HOA had been humbled, yes, but pride doesn't disappear overnight. They would cling to whatever scraps of authority they had left. Still, the tide had turned. For the first time, it wasn't me against them. It was us against control. And as I stood with my neighbors, the rain barrels glistening in the afternoon sun, I realized the fight had never been about water or power alone. It was about independence, community, and the simple truth that no storm, whether from the sky or from a boardroom, could break people who stood together. But the final chapter was yet to come. Because what began as a rebellion and grew into a revolution was about to transform into something even greater, a legacy. The courtroom victory was more than just a personal win. It was the moment the tide permanently shifted. The HOA had thrown everything they had at me. Fines, threats, sabotage, even the ultimate weapon of a lien. And yet when the dust settled, they were the ones exposed. Their power, once absolute, now lay cracked and fragile for all to see. But revolutions don't end with a single ruling. They ripple outward, transforming everything in their path. And that's exactly what happened next. Within weeks of the judge's decision, the neighborhood moved to act. The petition that had helped me in court grew into something larger, a demand for new leadership. An emergency vote was called. Homeowners filled the meeting hall, not with the quiet obedience the board was used to, but with voices ready for change. The president tried to fight it. She stood at the podium repeating the same tired warnings about property values and aesthetic standards. But the words rang hollow. Too many people had seen the truth. Families kept cool during heat waves, fridges humming during blackouts, gardens flourishing under captured rainwater. The old arguments about uniformity and control no longer held any weight. When the vote was tallied, the results were undeniable. The president and several board members were removed. In their place, new representatives were chosen, people who understood that a neighborhood thrives not under control, but under cooperation. For the first time, the HOA felt like it actually belonged to the community, not the other way around. And with that shift came opportunity. What started as barrels in my yard quickly evolved into a block-wide project. Neighbors who once scoffed at the idea now installed their own rainwater systems. Some set up small solar grids, others linked into the battery reserves we built together. Over time, the network grew, weaving house to house, barrel to barrel, until our entire street operated on a shared system of renewable energy. We became known as the Rainwater Block. Reporters returned, this time not to cover conflict but to showcase innovation. Articles appeared in local papers, then regional magazines, and eventually national outlets. People from other cities reached out, asking how they could build the same independence in their own neighborhoods. What began as a fight against petty fines had transformed into a blueprint for community resilience. The old HOA president, bitter in defeat, eventually moved away. She left behind more than just a vacant house. She left behind a cautionary tale of what happens when control becomes obsession. Her name, once spoken with fear in every household, became little more than a reminder of how close we had come to losing something greater than freedom, the spirit of unity. But for us, the future was bright. Quite literally. As seasons passed, the barrels filled and emptied, the turbines spun, and the solar panels soaked up the sun. Children grew up knowing the sound of rain wasn't just weather, it was power. Families sat under porch lights powered by the very storms that once threatened to divide us. And each time a blackout swept across the city, our block stood as an island of light in the darkness. For me, the journey had started with frustration. A single letter in my mailbox, a demand to remove barrels I had built with my own hands. I never set out to lead a movement, never intended to spark a revolution. I just wanted to water my plants and save a little on the water bill. But sometimes, the smallest acts of defiance become the sparks that ignite change. Looking back, I realized the HOA had unwittingly given me a gift. By trying to break me, they pushed me to build something greater than I ever imagined. They forced me to dig deeper, think bigger, and ultimately turn resistance into resilience. And in the end, what they tried to destroy became the very thing that saved the neighborhood. It wasn't about barrels anymore. It wasn't even about electricity. It was about community. People realizing that together they could weather any storm, whether it came from the sky or from those who sought to control them. And so, every time rain falls now, I smile. Because I know each drop carries a story of defiance, a story of resilience, a story of how one fight with an HOA turned into free power for an entire neighborhood, a legacy built not from rules and fines but from rain.